Welcome to City Talk, the show about what's working, what's not, and what's next for the places we live. I'm Mary Rowe. It's no secret that Canada is in a housing crisis. Over the past 20 years, the ratio of house prices to income has risen over 70%. In other words, a growing chunk of people's paychecks are going towards housing. Renters are paying more too, and some people are actually being driven to the streets. A recent report from Ontario's municipalities found that homelessness rose a staggering 25% just over the last 2 years. Governments at all orders and across the political spectrum are talking about the urgency of the issue. But not everyone agrees on the root cause. Is it just about reducing red tape and letting builders build? Or does the government need to intervene more in a market that has failed to address the scope and scale of the problem? To talk about this, I'm joined by Carolyn Whitzman and Murtaza Haider. Carolyn is the author of the book Home Truths, Fixing Canada's Housing Crisis, and she's also a senior researcher and adjunct professor at the University of Toronto's School of Cities. Murtaza is a professor and the Radhe Krishna Gupta Executive Chair in Cities and Communities and the Executive Director of the newly formed Cities Institute at the University of Alberta. Carolyn and Murtaza, let's start by testing the premise of the conversation. Would you both say that Canada is in a housing crisis? And if so, why would you say that? Carolyn, you first.
So I think that you're absolutely right, Mary, with some of the both statistics you were giving earlier about the growing gulf between housing costs, whether you're a homeowner or renter, or whether you don't have a home, and your income. And I think that also, there was an article written a few years ago called The Housing Theory of Everything, and it does have implications for certainly dinner table conversation, but more importantly, healthcare, education, economic productivity, our future as a country. All of those are affected by the housing crisis. And again, to break it down a little bit more, about a third of households are the straightforward owners of their home. About a third of households own houses with the help of a mortgage that they owe a bank. And a lot of them are increasingly anxious about how house prices are going to do in relation to their large mortgages. And then about a third of households are renters, and definitely renters are in a lot of anxiety right now around tenure security as well as affordability.
Mm-hmm. So it's pervasive in that way wherever you participate in the market. Murtaza, what is your view? Are we in a housing crisis?
Yes, we are in a housing crisis, but I would say there are a couple of things that we have to remember. A, it's not new. If you look at Maclean's front page story in 1969, May of 1969, it said that if you do not already own a home by now, forget about your dream of ever owning a home. That's 1969. The average price in Toronto was, $30,000. So when people say we are in a housing crisis now, that's a gross misrepresentation of the fact that we have been in a housing crisis. And the reason we have been in a housing crisis for the past 5 decades is because we have not built enough housing. Secondly, we are not alone. I'm working on a large project with one of the research donor agencies, and we have studied housing supply in 10 economies in Western Europe. And guess what? From America to New Zealand to Australia to Austria to England to everyone is in a housing crisis, and they are in a housing crisis because they have not been building enough housing. Housing supply is the big challenge. There are other factors, small factors, but housing supply is a big challenge because we did not build. I'll give you one number that should stay with people's understanding. In 1970s, we were building 12,000 new homes for 1 million Canadians. 12,000 new homes a year for 1 million Canadian. That went down to 6,000 homes per million Canadian by mid-1990s. There have been a little bit of uptick, but we have never built more than 3 million homes in any decade since the 1970s. And that has been our challenge. It's a self-inflicted wound, if you ask me. We could build a lot more. We have the expertise, we have the know-how, but somehow we failed to collectively deliver on building housing.
If this has been a challenge for 50 years, What is the impediment to us actually addressing it? Carolyn, you first.
Well, it wasn't one decision. It was a whole bunch of decisions. And some of those decisions might have made sense at the time, but no longer make sense. So one of the decisions that happened, and we're going to be focusing a lot on the year 1972, it was a really important year for a number of reasons. Capital gains tax was brought in. It's a wealth tax. It means that the federal government is availing itself of wealth, but the principal property was exempted. That is, the house that you live in was exempted. And that made sense when we had pension plans that weren't as great. We were just starting to have a Canada pension plan. It made sense because a man's average life expectancy at the time was about 70, and a woman's average life expectancy was around 75. Well, now life expectancies are 80 and 85, respectively. And the notion that the home should be the principal mechanism for retirement investment doesn't really work as well anymore. And the principal property exemption to the capital gains tax, it's one of the many reasons why land prices started going up, and that housing began being seen by policymakers as an investment rather than a place to live in your entire life. Again, it was a different world then. Many people had jobs for life, but we live in a different world now, and a world where we have to diversify our retirement investments.
The fact that we did not have a capital gains assessment against our principal residence, why is that a disincentive to creating more housing?
It wasn't a disincentive to create more housing. There were a lot of other things that came in and made housing supply more difficult, and absolutely supply is a determinant of the price. But one of the other determinants of costs going up is the huge increase in land prices.
Land price. That's the line you're drawing. You're saying as soon as we turn that asset and we treat it that way, then there's all sorts of forces that conspire to make it scarcer so that it has more value.
As soon as you treat it as a preferred stock,
okay,
it's going to be a stock that a lot of people are investing in and flipping and trying to make as much money as possible in order to have as comfortable retirement as possible.
So we commodified it. Wow. Murtaza, how did we get into this mess?
Well, let me just say that because of housing, immigrants get a chance to level the playing field. You take this out, immigrants will never catch up to the native-born Canadians. And I'm not just stating an opinion. In fact, Statistics Canada did a study and said how long it took and how it was able for identical cohorts tracked over 30 years. And it turned out the immigrants who actually got into housing were able to have as much wealth as their native-born cohorts if they were followed over a 30-year period. And why were they able to do so? Because of housing. So when people say that it adversely affects immigrants, it's quite the contrary. The housing markets have helped immigrants catch up to the native borns, or otherwise they will never be able to. They will always be behind them in wealth generation 20, 30 years ago. I'm not stating an opinion. It's Statistics Canada's detailed study. I wrote about it in National Post because a lot of it was technical, so I had to translate it, but it's well documented. The other thing is capital gains, and I liked what Caroline mentioned. The capital gains tax affected the construction of purpose-built rental in Canada. That was the Carter Commission was put in place by the Conservatives at that time, and the Carter Commission came out and said we should have a capital gains tax. Basically, they were photocopying what they saw in England at that time. England did it about 5-10 years earlier. So they came in and they established this capital gains tax. The problem with capital gains tax was they did not index it to inflation. And at that time, when inflation was 10-15%, now you are the owner, landlord, you bought your purpose-built rental, 10 years later, it's doubled in price. Now you're paying taxes on the increase in value and you're paying taxes on inflation. And that was the dumbest thing to do. 50 years have passed and no one is able to get this fixed. I don't know why. There's not much math in it that you should not ask people to pay taxes on inflation. And at that time, it was meaningful. Why? Because the inflation wasn't 2%. At that time, the inflation was 10% or higher. So what was the result? The construction of purpose-built rental went down to zero. All the way up to mid-90s, there was pretty much no purpose-built rental construction anywhere. That affected the most vulnerable of the Canadians, and those most vulnerable of the Canadians are those who are renters, and renters have significantly lower incomes than homeowners. So we were not able to protect them because we did not build enough. And in the beginning of your introduction, you mentioned the security of tenure. Well, if they go and rent from the condos, if they rent openly, where this is not a purpose-built rental unit, then they don't have the security of tenure. Even if it's affordable, there's no security of tenure. So we made a mistake. We failed to correct it. It was in the Conservatives platform, I think, a few years ago, that if you sell a purpose-built rental building but invest that money into another purpose-built rental, then you don't have to pay capital gains on it. And so that was a good thing. But then again, it hasn't been implemented. But your question wasn't that. The question was why we haven't built. I'll tell you why we haven't built. We went crazy with regulation. We have over-regulated this industry. Do you know that we have more workers now? With the number of workers who built 2.7 million homes in the 70s, that was about 250,000 or less. Now we have 650,000 workers working in residential construction now in Canada, and we're still building 250,000 homes a year. So we have over-regulated, overburdened. Our zoning regulations are out of this are completely out of whack. At some point in time, and that's just in the past couple of years, it was taking at times 3 years just to get the zoning approvals for a high-rise construction in Toronto. Now, how do you go to up to 3 years? So by the time 36 months have passed, your cost-benefit analysis, your pro forma analysis is no longer valid. We did it to ourselves. Nobody else did it.
Listen, you two are so smart. I'm going to just keep trying to drill down on some really basic things to understand. First of all, in Canada, who builds houses and housing?
There has always been a mix of big developers and small developers. One of the, and you're going to hear a lot of areas of agreement between Murtaza and I. One of the impacts of adding a tremendous amount of complication and regulation and differences between cities and differences within cities is, ironically, you'd think all of that differentiation would mean a lot of small developers. No, it's made it really, really easy to have tall and sprawl and big developers, and it's made it incredibly difficult for new ideas, new developers, homeowner developers to build. So again, I don't want to be a nostalgist, but a lot of homes in Canada 100 years ago were self-built. You could buy home kits. So
yeah, I remember John Van Nostrand has said this, that he's got a statistic about what percentage of homes in Toronto were self-built in the 40s. It's something like 60%. And as you say, there was the Sears catalog. You could buy a house. So somewhere in there, you just used that phrase, tall and sprawl. Can I just interpret what I'm hearing from both of you? Are you saying that the regulatory regime and zoning and all these layers of sophisticated rules and layers meant that we've had to concentrate housing development within a sector that had to have the resources to be able to navigate all that? And that would mean you got to go big, you got to go tall, versus much more modest, smaller companies, smaller numbers of units. Is that what's happened?
Well, you need a lot of money. You need a lot of money in order to hang fire for 3 years. So what Murtaza was saying is you need, it would be very difficult if you're running on a marginal kind of return, as any non-market developer, for instance, would be doing, to hang on for 3 years and face off NIMBY and end up with dueling, lawsuits, especially planning court and all of that, if you don't have a lot of resources.
Mary, here's a shout out to my good friend Mike Vazzelli. He's a professor at Western University. We both were doing PhD together. We were probably the only two people who decided to PhD thesis on builders and development because everything else is demand focused in Canada.
Mike and I did our PhD together at Mac. That's amazing. What a small world.
There you go. So guess what? From Mike Boselli's work till now, nothing has changed. And what he found was very interesting, and that is that we have a house building industry in Canada that has only a small number, very small number of large builders. And the bulk are small builders, so much so that Statistics Canada last year released a report, maybe it was this year, that most of the builders have fewer than 5 employees. That tells you what problem is. The problem is on the industry side that there has to be a lot of amalgamation that has to happen, because if you are a builder with 5 employees, you do not have the agency to negotiate the kind of bargains you need for material supplies and zoning approvals. It's only the big developers who can do this. And Canada has a very small number of big developers, and there lies the problem. So if you're a small builder, you're building 5, 10, 15 homes, maybe even 50 homes. You do not have the warehouses, the technology, the capacity to do this. And the future for us has to be modular and prefab construction. And guess what? Most of these guys would resist that. Why? Because they don't have the ability to go prefab. It's only the likes of Mattamy Homes that you remember. Gilligan family announced that they are going with a new factory for prefab construction. They would like to build about 3,000 units. So yes, the industry is not structured in Canada to build the kind of homes at the pace, at the scale that we need. And the reason is they're atomized. And guess, is it a case today? No, this is a case for the last 30 years, at least going back to Boselli's doctoral dissertation, that this has been the case in Ontario and most likely in other cities and other provinces as well.
And I just want to square that circle. So there are a lot of big firms. I mean, I don't think you need to look very far to look at Daniels and a lot of big firms. There aren't a lot of big builders. So there's big firms.
Okay.
They build housing. That is, there are a lot of developers who build large subdivisions, etc. But then the actual builders are small. Am I wrong, Murtaza?
No, actually, you're absolutely right. But big builders are in fact umbrella groups. And they still have like 5, 10, 50 or 100 employees, but they are umbrella groups. All they're doing is scheduling the trades. So the trades are the ones who are building it, but because no big builder owns the plumbing, the roofing, the concreting, and everything else, they are just schedulers with trades. And at the end of it are trades that were going to build these things. So it wouldn't really help if you have 5 builders who have the same set of trades. And and why it's important, because when the under construction units start to increase, the same amount of workforce is involved. So you can't start new projects. So you would see that when under completion units go up, our starts go down. Why? Because at a certain point in time, whoever could hold a hammer is already employed.
Yeah, people need to get that.
Yes.
I think that this is a cyclical industry that everybody is witness to at every scale, whether you're in a small community or a big community. And as you just suggested, if you see projects moving forward, you know that pretty well anyone with a skill is probably engaged in some aspect of that site. And we have the same issue with infrastructure builds. You know, when you start to see enormous investments in public infrastructure, that's where the trades are going. And so you can imagine it's very hard to supply both new housing construction and, oh yes, we're building new transit lines and redoing the sewer lines. So let's talk for a minute.
No, Mary, can one point?
Yeah.
At one point when we were doing the construction of the underground subway extension from Toronto into Vaughan, that was a very big project. It was very difficult to find a licensed, experienced electrician.
Sure.
All of them were underground working there, right? So so the cost of housing goes up.
Let's talk about that, because what do we do about that? You know, how you've got a federal government that is very ambitious about build, baby, build, and are we going to be? So let me just ask you each that. You saw the housing platform. You know what the Carney government's priorities are, and they have a priority around nation build. You just referred to it, Murtaza. Nation building projects, large infrastructure, and also housing. So of the options that are available to us, where do you think our emphasis needs to be? Carolyn, you first, then Murtaza.
Well, housing is infrastructure.
Yes.
I don't have an easy or simple answer to you, for you, Mary. I mean, I think that the general what governments have been talking about is great. What they've been doing is not so great. So what governments have been talking about at all levels since the 1990s is that we need more housing near, let's say, rapid transit in cities, and we need more rapid transit near housing in cities. One of them is easier than the other, and that is housing near already existing infrastructure such as rapid transit and sewers and the community centers and schools and all of that other infrastructure, health centers, parks. So we definitely need the kind of action on upzoning, on simplifying building code regulations in order to get a lot more housing.
What else do we need to do? Murtaza, you take one. What do we need to do?
Well, first of all, you have to realize where the opposition comes from. There are three entities which you have to fight. One are NIMBYs, not in my backyard crowd. The other one are bananas. Absolutely crazy bananas. These are build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything.
We've got NIMBYs, which are not in my backyard. Then we've got people that are build absolutely nothing.
These
anywhere.
Yes, anywhere near anything, right? So and there are many of those. Some of them masquerade as environmentalists. So they are saying, don't do anything, no daycare in my neighborhood because our kids are grown up. But the other thing, and there's another one that's called NIMTOs.
Who are NIMTOs?
NIMTOs are amazing. You find them in any city council, not in my term of office. So the NIMTOs are, I like the idea. It's amazing. We should do it. But if I were to say yes to it, I won't be able to be re-elected. So not in my term of office. I will champion this as soon as I leave municipal politics or whatever politics they are in. And that's it. NIMBYs, NIMTOs, and bananas are up against creating tons of problems with us, for us in terms of creating. Upzoning is built, densifying is one way of capitalizing on the infrastructure you have already put in place. And there's this private good and there's public good. There's a concept called eminent domain. Eminent domain means that whenever the state feels that something has to be done in public interest, and that could be building the new building for the New York Times. That was made possible because of eminent domain in New York because one of the owners wasn't selling. So basically, you look at the collective benefit, you look at the future generations. We want to provide the future generations of Canadians and Ontarians and others to be able to live, afford a life, and build a future that is prosperous for all of us. That would require a lot of affordable housing, a lot of infrastructure. So I believe the Carney government is on the right track, but they have to be more aggressive and take these fights head on. I mean,
how does the federal government take on? These are local fights. NIMBY, bananas, and NIMTOs are all manifesting in local councillor wards. And I'm just wondering, how do we actually break that logjam to build the supply? Because the Prime Minister can say all these things, but he doesn't actually have line of sight into things around the corner.
Oh, they absolutely do. I mean, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau came in and he said, "I will respect local democracy, and I will build consensus." You never build consensus. This never happens. That was again another self-inflicted wound of promising something that would actually damage your own agenda. So he said, "Yes, I will respect local democracy." Guess what? Nothing got built to the extent that we needed. So Carney has to be different. Prime Minister Carney has to say, we will do whatever it takes. Municipalities are creatures of provinces under the Canadian Constitution. Provinces are parents and municipalities are children. If we really want to do something, provinces can, given the Canadian Constitution and the control they have, can step in and prevent municipalities from blocking all the construction that they have been blocking. Look at what happened in California. California had this California Environmental Quality Act for the last 50 years. It has been used to prevent any type of development in not just in green, pristine areas. More resistance and more applications were filed against upzoning than in greenfield development. Guess what the governor did? He signed 2 laws, 2 bills, and gone. Now there are going to be exemptions. People want to build housing, you can.
Actually, the Housing Accelerator Fund was pretty effective, and it was pretty effective partly because I think it gave some cover to some of these NIMTOs that Murtaza was talking about. In other words, some of these municipal elected officials who were unwilling to make the kinds of zoning changes that were necessary to use existing infrastructure effectively. So I saw that happen in real time. I mean, it's a long story how I saw it happen in real time, but I saw it happen in real time in Calgary, where Calgary Council said, we're not too sure. And then some folks got to them that day and said, you realize how much infrastructure funding through the Housing Accelerator Fund you're threatening by making this decision, which may make your constituents happy, but not having infrastructure would make them very unhappy. And by the end of the day, they decided to revisit that council decision. So I have seen the Housing Accelerator Fund work in real time. And now it's time, I'd argue, and certainly the new government's argued, for a new generation of Housing Accelerator Fund agreements. So the federal government can and should be acting for the benefit of all Canadians by trying to get rid of some of the parochial politics that have been dominating zoning. I would argue that the federal government also needs to have a stern discussion with provinces and territories who, for instance, have been allowing tremendous increases in evictions, who have not been very good on tenant rights, have not been very good on social assistance payments, which haven't gone up with inflation since, again, the 1990s, and are a leading contributor to homelessness, because homelessness is about the gap between income and rent. And I'd argue that the provinces and territories have been the leading level of government in contributing to homelessness. So I think the federal government has to be the bully in this situation. And the way it can be the bully is by having the greatest powers and the greatest revenues, which it does, and tying infrastructure funding to some basic pro-housing work, which includes both supply and protecting people's housing.
Actually, I'm in agreement with you, Caroline, that the Housing Accelerator Fund did a lot of good, especially on the purpose-built rentals side. If you see in the last 5 years, there has been a significant increase in the construction of purpose-built rental. And I think a lot of it has to do with Housing Accelerator Fund. And I think the idea of building infrastructure, there's already the programs out there. There's, I think, a $30 billion infrastructure program, especially focusing on public transit, that has an affordable housing component attached to it. There's lots of good stuff. This is all scattered all over the place. What is needed is to do it fast and do it aggressively. We spend too much time building consensus, and then 10 years are over, and then a new government comes in, and we end up in a different direction. So right now is the time. Let's just do it.
So, I hear you both sort of calling, perhaps I'm putting a qualifier on this that's more on Carolyn's side of the equation, for a beneficent bully, but the idea that we would just get down to it. The Housing Accelerator Fund, the CUI, is very familiar with this because we were engaged in the early stages. And what, just for our listeners to benefit from the understanding this, what it had is it was a carrot, in essence. It had what is called conditionality to it. The federal government will invest if you do the following. And it took a lot of effort to kind of hammer out what that consensus would be. And often municipal staff are much more willing to be ambitious about what they believe is the right thing to do as professional staff versus their bosses, who are the NIMTOs, who can't deal with the political fallout of what would happen to do the right thing. And I think this is where so much of city building is caught between a rock and a hard place, because politicians want to get reelected and they're accountable, and our democratic system is dependent on them to be accountable. But often the folks in the trenches doing the actual work are the ones who will say, well, actually, the right thing to do is X. And often the right thing is a kind of prescription that lots of folks have a lot of trouble with. I just want a last word from each of you. If you were the prime minister and you were trying to move, as we've said, a decades-old challenge, where would you put the government's resources right now? Last comment to each of you, Carolyn and then Murtaza.
Yeah, I'd be resourcing a whole bunch of choices, affordable choices, and I'd be doing everything I could to make sure that those affordable choices aren't being strangled by regulation.
Okay, there you go. Murtaza, what would you do?
I will be squarely focused on having the public sector focused on building social housing and increase the public sector housing stock, which in most Canadian cities is around 5% or so, even less in some cities. I believe the most vulnerable in our society are those who are priced out of the cheapest rent. And if the federal government wants to improve, it should improve the welfare of those who are most vulnerable. And public sector housing or social housing is the responsibility of the government. Previous governments have made the mistake of taking it off their shoulders and putting it on private developers and landlords. That's not their responsibility. If I'm the Prime Minister of Canada, I would focus on increasing the supply of social housing to protect the dignity and living standards of those who are the most disadvantaged in our society.
I think the two of you just agreed.
Amen to that. No, absolutely.
It's a bit of a miracle. Listen, thanks, gang. Honestly, the three of us could have I could have just listened carefully to the two of you and occasionally chimed in with a dumb question, but we could have stayed on for several hours. It's such a complex set of situations, but I appreciate the call to action that you're making, that nobody can be sitting, in their chair slumping over this. Everybody has to be heads on, starting to figure out how we're each going to contribute. And I want to thank both Carolyn and Murtaza for joining us on City Talk to talk about what's one of the most demanding challenges we've got in this moment in time.
Thank you, Mary. Always a pleasure.
Thank you indeed. It was indeed great to join you and Caroline. I'm really grateful. Thank you.